When most people hear the word fairy, their minds conjure images of delicate winged creatures no bigger than your thumb, glowing with ethereal light as they flit through moonlit gardens, waving tiny wands and granting wishes. Perhaps they think of Tinkerbell from Peter Pan, or the fairy godmother from Cinderella, benevolent beings whose only purpose is to help and delight. This vision of fairies has been shaped by centuries of Victorian romanticism, children's stories, and Disney animation, but these saccharine depictions bear almost no resemblance to the fairies of Celtic mythology, creatures far more complex, dangerous, and fascinating than any modern reimagining could capture. The fairies of Irish, Scottish, and Welsh tradition were not diminutive beings with gossamer wings. They were human-sized or even larger, possessing immense power and living according to their own inscrutable rules. They could bring fortune or ruin, offer gifts or curses, and their relationship with humanity was one of constant tension and negotiation. To the Celtic peoples, fairies were not fantasy, but reality, forces of nature that demanded respect, caution, and careful observance of ancient customs. They inhabited a world that existed alongside our own, separated by the thinnest of veils, and the consequences of crossing them could be devastating. The Celtic fairy tradition represents one of the richest and most enduring folklore systems in the world. From the mist-shrouded hills of Ireland to the rugged highlands of Scotland, from the ancient forests of Wales to the storm-battered coasts of Cornwall, stories of fairy encounters have been passed down through countless generations. These tales served many purposes in Celtic society. They explained the unexplainable, from sudden illnesses to crop failures. They enforced social norms and taught children to be cautious. They preserved cultural memory and connected communities to their landscape. And perhaps most importantly, they acknowledged that the world contained mysteries beyond human understanding, forces that could not be controlled but only respected. Today, we journey into the shadowed realm of Celtic fairies, exploring their origins, their nature, and their enduring influence on Celtic culture. We will meet the noble Tuatha Dé Danann, who became the fairy folk, encounter the divided courts of Scottish tradition, learn of the Banshees whose wails herald death, and discover the dark truth behind Changeling legends. This is not a tale of whimsical wish-granters, but of powerful beings who commanded fear and reverence in equal measure. To understand Celtic fairies, we must first travel back to the mythological prehistory of Ireland, to a time when divine beings walked the earth and shaped the land itself. According to Irish legend, long before the arrival of mortal humans, Ireland was ruled by the Tuatha Dé Danann, whose name translates to the people or tribe of the goddess Danu. These were not ordinary beings, but a race of god-like entities who arrived on Irish shores shrouded in dark clouds so thick they eclipsed the sun for 3 days. The Tuatha Dé Danann were beings of extraordinary power and beauty. They were skilled in all arts, from smithcraft to poetry, from war to magic. Ancient texts describe them as warriors and druids, kings and sorcerers, creatures of such preternatural beauty that mortals could scarcely look upon them without being overcome. They possessed the ability to shapeshift, assuming any form they desired. They wielded magical weapons of tremendous power and commanded the forces of nature itself. In many ways, they were deities, though whether the ancient Celts worshipped them as gods remains a subject of scholarly debate. For generations untold, the Tuatha Dé Danann ruled Ireland in what many consider a golden age. They fought against the monstrous Fomorians, beings of chaos and darkness, in epic battles that shaped the very landscape. They brought knowledge, culture, and order to the island. But their reign was not destined to last forever. According to the mythological chronology preserved in medieval Irish manuscripts, a new people came to Ireland, mortal warriors known as the Milesians or the Sons of Meal. These were the ancestors of the Gaelic Irish, human beings who sailed from Iberia seeking new lands to conquer. The war between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Milesians was fierce and terrible, but ultimately the mortal warriors prevailed. Some versions of the tale suggest this was inevitable, that the age of the divine was passing and the age of humanity was dawning. Faced with defeat, the Tuatha Dé Danann negotiated terms of surrender. The Milesians would take the surface world, the green fields and forests, the mountains and valleys. But the Tuatha Dé Danann would not leave Ireland entirely. Instead, they would retreat into the hollow hills, the ancient burial mounds that dotted the landscape, dwelling in an otherworld that existed parallel to the mortal realm. This retreat underground transformed the Tuatha Dé Danann. No longer gods ruling openly, they became the AOC, which translates to the folk of the fairy mounds. The word sidhe, or sidhe, refers to the burial mounds themselves, ancient Neolithic structures that became portals between the mortal world and the fairy realm. Over time, as stories were told and retold, as Christian scribes recorded pagan legends, the AOC became known simply as fairies, though they retained much of their divine power and nature. The transformation from gods to fairies represents one of the most fascinating aspects of Celtic mythology. When Christianity spread through Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, the old gods could not simply be erased from cultural memory. Instead, they were reinterpreted, their status diminished, but their existence acknowledged. Some Christian writers claimed the fairies were fallen angels, spirits who had revolted against God, but whose sins were not grave enough for hell, leaving them to dwell in the spaces between heaven and earth. Others maintained they were the descendants of the Tuatha Dé Danann, explaining their supernatural powers while avoiding direct acknowledgement of pagan divinity. Regardless of theological interpretation, the fairy folk retained their connection to the ancient mounds and sacred sites of Ireland. The sidhe, those grassy hills that rose mysteriously from the landscape, were understood to be the palaces and courts of the fairy people. Inside these mounds, the fairies lived much as humans did, with their own kingdoms and hierarchies, their own celebrations and conflicts. They farmed and feasted, they danced and made music. They loved and quarreled. Time moved differently in their realm, with days passing like hours and years like weeks for any mortal unfortunate enough to wander inside. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not truly die out but transformed, becoming an integral part of how Celtic peoples understood their world. They were the original inhabitants, the first owners of the land, and their presence permeated every aspect of the landscape. This connection to place, to the very bones of the earth, gave Celtic fairies a power and authority that distinguishes them from fairy traditions elsewhere in the world. If you were to encounter a fairy from Celtic tradition, you would not see the tiny winged creature of Victorian imagination. Celtic fairies were human-sized or larger, beings who could pass for mortal if they chose, though their otherworldly beauty or strangeness would often give them away. They had no need for wings, possessing the innate ability to fly through sheer magical power. Their appearance could be breathtakingly beautiful or unsettlingly strange, depending on their nature and mood. The physical characteristics of fairies varied. Some appeared as tall, golden-haired beings of impossible beauty, with eyes that seemed to hold the depths of ancient wisdom. Others were shorter and stockier, resembling weathered humans who had lived far longer than any mortal could. Their clothing might be rich and fine, woven from materials unknown to human craft, or it might be crude and outdated, frozen in the fashion of centuries past. Some fairies bore the marks of their particular nature, like the green clothing associated with certain types, or the seaweed-tangled hair of water spirits, or the blood-red caps of murderous redcaps. What truly distinguished fairies from humans was not their appearance, but their powers. Fairies possessed abilities that made them both wondrous and terrifying. They could vanish from sight at will, becoming invisible to mortal eyes, or appearing only as a shimmer in the air. They could transform their shape, becoming animals or even inanimate objects. They wielded a form of magic the Irish called glamour, the power to make things appear other than they were. A pile of leaves might seem to be gold coins under fairy glamour, only to revert to worthless debris once the spell wore off. A beautiful feast might turn out to be nothing more than toadstools and grass. Fairies moved between worlds with ease, slipping from the mortal realm into their own otherworld and back again. They were strongest at liminal times, the in-between moments when the barriers between worlds grew thin. Twilight and dawn, the turning of the seasons, and particularly the Celtic fire festivals like Samhain became times of great fairy activity. On these occasions, humans needed to be especially vigilant, for the fairies would ride out in great hosts, visible to mortal eyes and dangerous to anyone they encountered. The relationship between fairies and humans was complex and fraught with danger. Fairies were not inherently good or evil in the human sense. They operated according to their own moral code, which often seemed capricious or inscrutable to mortal minds. A fairy might offer aid to a traveler who showed them respect, providing food or warning them away from danger. The same fairy might curse or abduct someone who offended them, even if the offense was unintentional. Fairies demanded courtesy and respect, and they had long memories for slights. Among Celtic communities, a whole system of beliefs and practices arose around maintaining good relations with the fairy folk. This tradition became known as the Credum Sidhe, the fairy faith, a collection of customs that existed alongside and often intertwined with Christianity. The fairy faith was not about worship, but about coexistence, acknowledging that fairies had power over many aspects of human life, and that prudence demanded certain precautions. Central to the fairy faith was the practice of making offerings to the fairies. Families would leave out food and drink, particularly milk, bread, and traditional cakes. These offerings were placed near fairy mounds or at the threshold of homes, gifts to ensure the fairies remained favorably disposed. Churning butter, a crucial household task, was particularly vulnerable to fairy interference. If churning took too long or the butter would not come, it was believed the fairies were stealing the cream. During churning, strict protocols had to be observed. No bad words could be spoken. No quarrels could take place. No drinking could occur, for all these things might invite fairy mischief. The fairies were rarely addressed directly or by their true names. Instead, people used euphemisms that acknowledged their power while avoiding provocation. The good neighbors, the fair folk, the gentry, the good people, the wee folk, all these terms served to speak of fairies without risking offense. This linguistic caution reflects the deep respect and fear the fairies inspired. Fairies were believed to have influence over virtually every aspect of life. They could grant prosperity or bring ruin. They could cure illnesses or cause them. They could ensure a good harvest or blight the crops. They could bless a marriage or curse it with infertility. This power meant that when unexplained events occurred, good or bad, fairies were often held responsible. A sudden stroke of luck or unexpected misfortune, both could be attributed to fairy intervention. In Scottish folklore, the fairy realm was understood to be divided into two great courts, a separation between light and dark, benevolence and malevolence. that gave structure to the complex world of the Fae. These courts were known as the Seelie and Unseelie, terms derived from Old Scots words meaning blessed and unblessed respectively. This division was not absolute, for fairies of both courts could be dangerous, but it provided a framework for understanding the varied nature of fairy encounters. The Seelie court comprised those fairies who could be, under the right circumstances, favorably disposed toward humans. The word Seelie derives from Old English and meant happy, lucky, or blessed, though calling them such may have been as much hopeful euphemism as accurate description. The Seelie fairies were known for seeking out human help when needed, for warning those who had accidentally offended them, rather than immediately seeking revenge, and for returning kindnesses with favors of their own. They were often described as beautiful, radiant beings, though their beauty could be dangerous in itself, entrancing mortals who looked upon them. The Seelie court was most active during twilight, that liminal time between day and night, when the boundaries of the world grew soft. They gathered in troops and held great processions through the countryside, riding on horses or traveling through the air. Those humans lucky enough to witness a Seelie procession might be offered gifts or granted visions of great beauty. But this benevolence had its limits. The Seelie fairies would avenge insults and could be prone to mischief even when not provoked. Their sense of proper behavior did not always align with human understanding, and what they considered a harmless prank might have serious consequences for mortals. The ranks of the Seelie court were said to include babies who had died due to parental abuse or neglect, warriors who fell fighting in just causes, and other good folk who had perhaps lapsed once in their lives and so could not access heaven. This belief reflects the syncretic nature of Celtic fairy lore, blending Christian concepts of the afterlife with older pagan traditions. The Seelie fairies might help mankind in tangible ways, providing bread to the poor and elderly, offering seed corn to hard-working but unlucky farmers, or leaving gifts for those they favored. In contrast, the Unseelie court comprised the darkly inclined fairies, malevolent beings who needed no provocation to bring harm upon humans. The Unseelie were associated with the night, with storms and darkness, with chaos and misfortune. Where the Seelie might be beautiful, the Unseelie were often described as ugly or monstrous, though some could assume pleasing forms to trick unwary mortals. They delighted in causing suffering and fear, attacking travelers on lonely roads, stealing children from cradles, shooting invisible arrows that caused sudden pain or paralysis, and tormenting humans in countless cruel ways. The Unseelie court included some of the most feared creatures in Scottish folklore. The Slough, or host, was a group of malevolent spirits said to be the souls of the unforgiven dead. They flew through the night sky in great storm clouds, hunting for dying souls to carry away. Windows on the west side of houses were kept tightly shut, especially during wakes, to prevent the Slough from stealing the souls of the dying. Redcaps were vicious fairies who haunted old castles and towers, murdering travelers and dyeing their caps in the victim's blood. The Knuckle-a-Vee was a grotesque creature of terrifying power, a skinless horse-like being with a humanoid torso, blamed for bringing drought and disease. Despite their names, neither court was entirely consistent in its treatment of humans. Some Seelie fairies could be cruel and capricious, while some Unseelie beings might occasionally show mercy or even offer help. The division between the courts was less about absolute good and evil, and more about general disposition and behavior. Both courts operated according to their own laws and logic, which often seemed incomprehensible to human understanding. The idea of the two courts may have Christian elements woven into older pagan beliefs. The contrast between blessed and unblessed, holy and unholy, echoes Christian dualism between angels and demons. Yet the courts also reflect older understanding of the dual nature of the world itself, the balance between forces of creation and destruction, order and chaos, light and darkness that predates Christianity. In the broader context of Celtic lands, the strict division into Seelie and Unseelie was primarily a Scottish phenomenon. Irish and Welsh traditions had their own ways of categorizing fairies, though they acknowledged the same basic reality that some fairy folk were more dangerous than others. Irish tradition distinguished between trooping fairies, who traveled in groups and could be of varied temperament, and solitary fairies, who were often malevolent or at least antisocial. This classification reflected different experiences and dangers associated with fairy encounters.
Within the broad category of fairy folk, Celtic tradition recognizes countless specific types of fairies, each with their own characteristics, habitats, and relationships with humans. Some of these creatures became famous far beyond their original cultural context, while others remained known only in specific regions or communities. Each type of fairy added to the rich complexity of Celtic supernatural belief.
A Banshee stands as perhaps the most famous fairy in Irish tradition, a figure of such power and dread that her name has entered languages worldwide. The Banshee, woman of the fairy mound, was a female spirit who attached herself to particular Irish families, especially those of ancient Gaelic lineage. Her role was to herald death, appearing before a family member's impending demise to keen and wail in mourning. The Banshee's cry was unmistakable, a sound that chilled the blood and froze the heart, a wailing lament that announced tragedy was at hand. Physical descriptions of the Banshee varied across Ireland. Some accounts described her as a pale woman with long red or golden hair, dressed in white or gray robes, her face beautiful but marked by the eternal sorrow of her purpose. Other traditions depicted her as a hag, a withered old woman with streaming white hair and eyes red from eternal weeping. She might appear washing blood-stained clothes in a river, a practice that marked her as a death omen, or she might be seen combing her long hair with a silver comb, another sign of impending doom.
A Banshee's wail served as a warning, giving families time to prepare for loss, to gather together, to make peace with the dying. In this sense, though she brought terrible news, her presence also brought a kind of gift, the knowledge that allowed for proper goodbyes and preparation. Yet hearing the Banshee was an experience of pure terror, for her appearance meant death was certain and imminent. In stark contrast to the solemn Banshee,
the Leprechaun embodies the mischievous, trickster aspect of fairy nature. These solitary fairies are perhaps the most widely recognized of all Celtic supernatural beings, though modern popular culture has significantly altered their original characteristics. In authentic Irish tradition, leprechauns were not jolly, rotund figures eager to share their pots of gold. They were solitary earth fairies, cobblers by trade, often described as small, withered old men with sharp features and sharper wits.
The leprechaun's most famous trait is his hidden pot of gold, treasure that he guards jealously and protects with every trick and deception at his disposal. According to legend, if a human captures a leprechaun, the fairy must reveal the location of his treasure. But leprechauns are masters of manipulation and misdirection. They will bargain, plead, and attempt to trick their captor into looking away for even a moment. The instant a leprechaun escapes a human's gaze, he vanishes, taking his treasure's location with him. Many tales tell of clever humans who thought they had outwitted a leprechaun, only to discover they had been deceived.
Leprechauns are ill-tempered and antisocial, preferring their solitary existence to any company. They take offense easily and hold grudges.
Yet they also represent an important aspect of Irish fairy belief, the acknowledgement that fairies have their own lives and occupations, that they exist for their own purposes rather than merely to interact with humans. The leprechaun's cobbling is real work, pursued with fairy skill and precision, not simply a quaint detail for storytelling. A Púca, known in Scotland as the Púca, represents the shape-shifting aspect of fairy nature. This creature embodies unpredictability, capable of appearing as various animals, most commonly a horse, but also a goat, dog, or rabbit, or even taking human form when it suited its purposes. The Púca's nature was deeply ambiguous. In some stories, it served as a helpful spirit, guiding lost travelers to safety or protecting farm animals. In others, it was a terrifying creature of mischief and malice. As a horse, the Púca would appear late at night, seeming tame and rideable. Any human foolish enough to mount it would find themselves taken on a wild, terrifying ride through the countryside, racing through thorns and across dangerous terrain, unable to dismount until the Púca decided to release them. The creature delighted in frightening humans, though it rarely killed them outright. After November, when the first frost came, it was said that no one should eat wild berries, for the Púca had spoiled them with his otherworldly presence. Among the most terrifying of Celtic supernatural beings was the Dullahan, a headless horseman who rode through the night, bringing death. Also known as Gan Cien, meaning without a head, this fairy carried its own severed head under one arm, or held high to see great distances. The Dullahan's head was grotesque, with a hideous grin that stretched from ear to ear and eyes that darted about, seeing everything, even in the darkest night. The head glowed with a faint, sickly light that illuminated its path. The Dullahan rode a black horse or drove a coach decorated with funeral objects, using a human spine as a whip. Wherever the Dullahan stalked, someone was fated to die. It would call out the name of the doomed person, and upon hearing their name, the individual's soul would be drawn forth, leaving their body to perish. The Dullahan was terrifying, not just for its grotesque appearance, but for its absolute power over death. No locked door could bar it. No barrier could stop it. The only defense against the Dullahan was gold, for fairies of all types feared this metal and would flee from its presence. These are but a few among countless fairy types in Celtic tradition. Each region, each community, had its own particular spirits and beings, from the water horses that lurked in lakes waiting to drown the unwary, to the Bean Naig, who washed the grave clothes of those about to die, from household brownies who helped with chores if treated well, to the malicious sprites who soured milk and tangled horses' manes. This diversity reflects the richness of Celtic spiritual belief and the deep connection between people and their landscape. Among all the beliefs surrounding Celtic fairies, few were as persistent or as troubling as the Changeling legend. This belief held that fairies would steal human babies from their cradles, replacing them with fairy children, or sometimes even enchanted pieces of wood made to resemble infants. The Changeling belief was widespread across Celtic lands and beyond, persisting into the modern era with sometimes tragic consequences. The reason fairies wanted human children was explained in various ways. Some said fairies found human children healthier and more beautiful than their own offspring, seeking to strengthen fairy bloodlines with human vitality. Others claimed fairy women had great difficulty in childbirth, with many fairy babies born sickly or deformed, leading fairies to steal healthy human children as replacements. Still others suggested that fairies needed humans to pay a tithe to hell every 7 years and preferred to sacrifice stolen mortals rather than their own kind. In some tales, elderly or infirm fairies were left in place of stolen children. allowing the old fairy to live out its final days in comfort, cared for by unsuspecting human parents. The children most at risk of fairy abduction were those who possessed qualities fairies valued. Beautiful babies with bright eyes and healthy complexions were particularly vulnerable. Fair hair, especially golden blonde, and light-colored eyes were said to attract fairy attention. But inner qualities mattered too. Clever, cheerful, or musically inclined children might be targeted. Babies who had not yet been baptized were considered especially vulnerable, lacking the protection of Christian blessing. Recognizing a changeling required careful observation, for the fairy child would initially resemble the stolen infant, but telltale signs would begin to appear. The changeling might have a wizened, old appearance with dark, knowing eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond an infant's years. Its temperament would be wrong, fussy and irritable when the original child had been placid, or eerily quiet when the child had been lively. The changeling would develop abnormally, either too quickly or too slowly. It might sprout a full set of teeth within weeks, or it might remain unable to walk or talk for years despite appearing physically healthy. A changeling's appetite would be voracious and insatiable, eating far more than any normal child, yet remaining thin and sickly in appearance. Some changelings displayed uncanny knowledge or abilities, speaking in complete sentences far too young, or demonstrating skill with musical instruments they should not know how to play. This latter sign reflects the fairy folk's legendary love of music. A changeling might reveal itself by dancing or playing music when it thought itself unobserved. The presence of a changeling brought misfortune to the household that harbored it. Crops might fail, livestock might sicken, and general bad luck would plague the family. Yet parents were advised to treat the changeling well, for the fairies would mirror any treatment the changeling received onto the stolen human child. Abusing the changeling meant condemning your own child to abuse in the fairy realm. Various methods were employed to either reveal a changeling's true nature or force its return. Many of these methods involved shocking the changeling into dropping its human disguise. One common test was to cook something absurd, such as brewing beer in eggshells or making a feast from a single grain of wheat. Upon witnessing such an impossible sight, the changeling would cry out in amazement, revealing that despite its apparent youth, it had lived for centuries and never seen such a thing. This exclamation would confirm its fairy nature. More aggressive methods involved threatening the changeling with fire or violence, though not actually harming it. The threat alone might be enough to bring the fairies to retrieve their own and return the human child. Some traditions held that taking the suspected changeling to a fairy mound or ring and threatening to leave it there would prompt the fairies to make the exchange. Other methods included sprinkling salt on the changeling, holding it over running water, or placing it in a shovel full of hot coals from the fire while keeping it just out of reach of the flames. These practices, when examined through modern understanding, reveal a darker aspect of the changeling belief. The signs of a changeling align closely with various conditions now recognized medically: developmental delays, autism spectrum disorders, genetic conditions, chronic illnesses, and many other variations from typical development. The changeling belief provided an explanation for these conditions in a time before medical science could offer answers. It allowed communities to make sense of children who were different, though it also enabled tragic mistreatment. The most infamous case occurred in Ireland in 1895, when a woman named Bridget Cleary fell ill. Her husband, Michael, became convinced she was a changeling, that fairies had stolen his real wife and left the sickly imposter in her place.
He and several family members subjected Bridget to various tests and cures, including forcing her to drink herbal concoctions and holding her over the fire. Bridget died from her injuries, her body burned. Michael Cleary's defense at his trial for murder was that he truly believed his wife was a changeling, and he was trying to force the fairies to return his real wife. He served 15 years in prison and left Ireland upon his release, the case standing as a grim reminder of the power of folklore beliefs and their potential for tragedy.
Yet the changeling legend also reflected real fears and griefs. Infant and child mortality rates were extremely high in pre-modern societies. The sudden death of a previously healthy child, unexplained illnesses, and developmental conditions were all terrifying realities for parents. The changeling belief offered a way to process this grief and confusion, providing an external explanation for tragedies that struck without warning or reason. Rather than accept that their child had died or become ill through pure chance or factors beyond their control, parents could believe their child still lived, healthy and happy in the fairy realm, even if the being in their home was no longer their child. Given the very real danger fairies posed in Celtic belief, entire systems of protective practices arose, passed down through generations as essential knowledge for survival. These protections ranged from everyday precautions to elaborate rituals, all designed to ward off fairy interference and maintain peaceful coexistence with the supernatural inhabitants of the land. Iron held pride of place among protective materials. Fairies of all types were said to fear and hate iron, unable to touch it without being burned. The reasons for this aversion were variously explained. Some said iron represented human craft and civilization, opposed to the wild, natural magic of the fairy realm. Others suggested iron's connection to blood, being used to shed it in violence, made it anathema to fairies. Regardless of the reason, iron's protective power was widely acknowledged. People carried small iron objects like nails, horseshoes, needles, or knives when traveling through areas associated with fairies. Horseshoes nailed above doorways, particularly with the ends pointing upward to catch good luck, protected homes from fairy intrusion. New mothers might keep scissors or fire tongs near their cradles to protect infants from being stolen. Salt, another common household substance, also provided protection. Salt represented preservation and purification, qualities opposed to fairy magic. Sprinkling salt around thresholds or mixing it with bathwater offered defense against fairy interference. In Scotland, during churning, a small amount of salt might be added to the cream to prevent fairies from stealing the butter. Rowan trees held powerful protective qualities in Celtic tradition. Also called mountain ash, rowan was sacred to the old gods and resistant to fairy magic. Sprigs of rowan hung over doorways or carried in pockets warded off enchantment. Rowan wood could be fashioned into protective charms or used to make tools that would be immune to fairy interference. Travelers might carry a rowan staff for protection on dangerous journeys. Certain other plants and herbs offered protection as well. Four-leaf clovers, rare variations of the common three-leaf plant, was said to break fairy glamours and allow humans to see through illusions. A person wearing a four-leaf clover could see fairies even when they attempted to remain invisible. Hawthorn, though sacred to fairies and never to be damaged, could be used protectively when treated with proper respect. Placing hawthorn branches at windows or doors on May Eve helped guard against fairy intrusion. St. John's wort, with its bright yellow flowers, was another protective herb, particularly effective when gathered on midsummer. Turning clothing inside out was a simple but effective protection when crossing areas known for fairy activity. This practice confused and warded off fairies, perhaps because it created disorder that interfered with their magic.
Similarly, carrying bread, particularly fresh-baked bread, offered protection, as fairies disliked this symbol of human domesticity and civilization. The bread represented the taming of nature through agriculture and craft, opposed to the wild magic of the fairy realm. Certain days required special precautions. May Eve, the night before the 1st of May, was particularly dangerous. On this night, fairies were extremely active, riding out in great hosts and causing mischief wherever they went. Livestock had to be protected with careful rituals. Fires had to be lit and maintained, and people avoided travel if possible. Samhain, the beginning of winter and the festival that became Halloween, was another time of heightened fairy activity. The veil between worlds grew thinnest on Samhain night, and the dead, as well as fairies, could cross into the mortal realm. Showing respect to fairy places was crucial. Throughout Celtic lands, certain locations were known to belong to the fairies. Ancient burial mounds, stone circles, certain trees, especially solitary hawthorns, standing alone in fields, caves, and natural features like unusual rock formations, all might be fairy habitations. Disturbing these places invited terrible consequences. Stories abounded of people who cut down fairy trees and were struck by misfortune. Their crops failed, their cattle died, they became ill or worse. Even in modern times, farmers often plow around fairy forts and leave them undisturbed, not from active belief, but from lingering respect for tradition and perhaps unwillingness to risk bad luck. When speaking of fairies, people used euphemisms and avoided direct naming. To speak of fairies directly was to invite their attention, which was usually best avoided. The good neighbors, the fair folk, the gentry, the people of peace themselves. All these terms allowed discussion of fairies without the danger of summoning them. This linguistic caution extended to telling stories about fairy encounters, which were often prefaced with disclaimers about hearing the tale from someone else, or assertions that one did not personally believe such things, even while relating the story with obvious conviction. Offerings represented another crucial aspect of maintaining good relations with fairies. Households regularly left out food and drink for the fairy folk, particularly milk, which fairies were known to love. These offerings might be placed at the threshold, near the hearth, or at fairy mounds and trees. The food had to be fresh and of good quality, for fairies would take offense at inferior offerings. Once left out, the offerings must not be touched by humans, even if the food appeared uneaten. Fairies consumed the essence or spiritual substance of the food, leaving the physical matter behind. Certain rituals had to be observed during everyday activities to prevent fairy interference. When carrying water from wells or streams, particularly at twilight, one must not look back or speak until safely home, lest fairies follow. When churning butter, as mentioned earlier, strict protocols prevented fairy theft of the cream. During spinning and weaving, care had to be taken not to offend any fairies who might be present. Some households left out small portions of every meal. Others poured the first milk from a cow onto the ground as an offering. These practices represented insurance, small tributes that helped maintain the delicate balance between human and fairy worlds. Despite all these precautions, fairy encounters still occurred. When they did, survival often depended on quick thinking and knowledge of fairy customs. If offered food or drink by fairies, one must refuse, for consuming fairy food meant becoming trapped in their realm. If carried off by fairies, one should try to touch iron or earth from the mortal realm, breaking the enchantment. If challenged by a fairy, polite refusal without direct confrontation offered the best chance of escape. And if one accidentally offended a fairy, immediate and sincere apology, accompanied by an offering, might placate them.
The world of the fairies existed parallel to the mortal realm, separated by boundaries that were invisible, yet absolute, except at certain times and places. This otherworld went by many names in Celtic tradition. The Irish called it Tir na Nog, the land of youth, or Mag Mell, the plain of delight. The Welsh knew it as Enon, while Scottish traditions spoke of multiple fairy realms existing in layers beneath and beyond the visible world.
These other worlds were places of impossible beauty and strange enchantment. Those who ventured into fairy lands described halls more magnificent than any mortal palace, with walls of crystal and gold, lit by lights that had no source. Gardens bloomed with flowers of colors unknown in the human world, their fragrances intoxicating and overwhelming. Rivers ran with sweet water or wine, and fruit trees bore their harvest eternally. The weather in fairy lands was always perfect, never too hot nor too cold, with gentle rains that brought no discomfort and sunshine that held no harshness. The inhabitants of these realms lived lives of eternal pleasure and beauty. They feasted and danced, made music and love, hunted and celebrated without the burdens that plagued mortal existence. Fairies knew no old age, no sickness, no decay. Their youth and beauty remained constant across the centuries. This eternal nature made the fairy realm deeply seductive to mortals, offering escape from the hardships and brevity of human life. Yet the fairy realm held terrible dangers for mortals who entered it. Chief among these was the distortion of time. A single night spent at a fairy feast might equal 7 years in the mortal world. A year in fairylands could be a century outside. Many stories tell of mortals who spent what seemed like days or weeks in the otherworld, only to return and find that generations had passed, their families long dead, their homes turned to ruins, their entire world changed beyond recognition. The tragic ballad of Ocean in Tir na Nog exemplifies this danger. Ocean was a great warrior and poet who fell in love with Neem, a fairy woman of extraordinary beauty. She invited him to accompany her to Tir na Nog, and he gladly accepted, riding with her across the waves to the land of youth. There he lived in perfect happiness, hunting and feasting, composing poetry, and enjoying Neem's love. After what seemed like 3 years, Ocean grew homesick and wished to visit Ireland once more. Neem warned him of the danger but provided him with her white horse, cautioning him not to dismount or let his feet touch Irish soil.
When Oisin reached Ireland, he found everything changed.
300 years had passed in the mortal world. His companions were long dead. The people spoke differently. Even the landscape seemed altered. As he leaned down from his horse to help some men move a boulder, his saddle girth broke and he fell to the ground. The moment his feet touched Irish soil, the 3 centuries caught up with him. His youth vanished in an instant, and he became an ancient, withered man. In some versions of the tale, he lived long enough to meet St. Patrick and tell his story before finally dying. A man from a bygone age, speaking of glories that had passed away.
Access to the fairy realm came through specific portals. The most common were the sidhe, the fairy mounds that dotted the Irish landscape. On certain nights, particularly the quarter days that marked the turning of seasons, these mounds would open, revealing passages into the otherworld. Other doorways included certain caves, particular trees, or bodies of water like lakes and sacred wells. Sometimes these portals were visible and well known, places to be avoided by the cautious. Other times they appeared suddenly and without warning, a door in a hillside that had not been there moments before, a path through the woods that seemed to lead nowhere, yet opened into fairy lands. Mortals might enter the fairy realm voluntarily,
lured by fairy music or the beauty of fairy folk. More often, they were taken against their will. abducted by fairies for various purposes. Some were stolen as infants, others taken as adults. Warriors might be carried off to fight in fairy battles, for fairies warred among themselves and valued human courage. Musicians and poets were prized in fairy courts, brought to perform at endless feasts. Beautiful women might be taken as fairy brides, while handsome men might become consorts to fairy queens.
Escaping the fairy realm proved extremely difficult.
The enchantments that bound mortals there were powerful, designed to make captives forget their former lives and embrace their new existence. The beauty and pleasure of fairylands clouded judgment and weakened will, yet certain actions could break the enchantment. Touching iron brought mortals back to themselves, though finding iron in the fairy realm was nearly impossible. Calling on Christian protection, particularly invoking the name of Christ or the Virgin Mary, might work, though this reflects later Christian additions to the stories. Refusing fairy food and drink maintained a connection to the mortal world, and sometimes, remarkably, love for those left behind proved strong enough to resist fairy enchantment and provide motivation to escape.
Those who returned from the fairy realm were forever changed.
Some brought gifts of poetry or music, skills taught by fairy masters. Others carried prophecies or hidden knowledge, but they also bore a sense of loss. For having seen the perfection of the Otherworld, the mortal realm seemed diminished and shabby by comparison. Many who returned pined for the fairy realm, unable to truly readjust to human existence. Some eventually wasted away, while others tried desperately to find their way back, though the doors to fairy lands seldom opened twice for the same person.
The arrival and spread of Christianity through Celtic lands profoundly affected fairy belief, though it did not erase it. Instead, a complex process of synthesis occurred, with Christian and pre-Christian elements blending and transforming each other. The result was a unique folk tradition that could encompass both Christian faith and belief in fairies, seeing no necessary contradiction between the two. Christian authorities faced a dilemma regarding fairies. They could not easily dismiss fairy beliefs as mere superstition, for too many people had experiences they attributed to fairy encounters. Complete denial would have alienated the very people the church sought to convert. Instead, Christian scholars and clerics developed theological explanations for fairies that incorporated them into Christian cosmology. One influential interpretation held that fairies were fallen angels, spirits who had joined Lucifer's rebellion against God, but whose sins were not grave enough for damnation to hell. When God cast out the rebel angels, some fell all the way to hell to become demons, while others were stopped mid-fall and remained trapped in the earth, air, and water of the mortal realm. These became the fairies, neither fully good nor fully evil, existing in a liminal state between heaven and hell. This explanation allowed for fairies' supernatural powers while subordinating them to Christian authority. Another Christian interpretation suggested fairies were the souls of unbaptized infants or pagans who died before Christ's coming. Not innocent enough for heaven, but not guilty enough for hell, these souls existed in an in-between state, inhabiting the natural world. This belief sometimes overlapped with ideas about purgatory, the intermediate state where souls were purified before entering heaven. Some clerics maintained that fairies were simply demons in disguise, using beautiful forms to tempt and deceive Christians. This interpretation led to condemnation of fairy beliefs as dangerous heresy. Yet this view never fully took hold in Celtic lands, where people maintained firm distinctions between fairies and demons, whatever clerics might claim. The transformation of the Tuatha Dé Danann from gods to fairies represents perhaps the most significant result of Christianization. The old deities
could not simply vanish from cultural memory, nor could they continue to be worshipped as gods. By recategorizing them as fairies, supernatural beings of power but not divinity, Celtic culture preserved its mythological heritage while technically conforming to Christian monotheism. This process of demotion from gods to fairies occurred gradually over centuries. Early Christian manuscripts recorded the old tales while adding framing elements that Christianized them. Gods became fairy folk or historical heroes with magical abilities. The supernatural remained, but was reinterpreted through a Christian lens. The ancient holy sites, the wells and springs and stone circles, were often rededicated to Christian saints, yet their association with the supernatural persisted, now attributed to fairies rather than the old gods. Interestingly, Christianity also provided new protections against fairies. Holy water, blessed metals, prayers, and the invocation of saints offered defense against fairy enchantment. The sign of the cross could ward off malevolent fairies. Church bells, with their blessed metal and sacred purpose, were said to drive fairies away. Yet these Christian protections existed alongside older methods, creating a layered system where people might use both iron and holy water, both ancient charms and Christian prayers. The persistence of fairy belief within Christian Celtic culture demonstrates the strength of the traditions. Even as Ireland, Scotland, and Wales became deeply Christian societies, fairy lore continued unabated. Priests might officially discourage fairy beliefs, yet many quietly maintained the same precautions as their parishioners. Stories tell of priests called upon to drive fairies from haunted locations or to help families deal with changelings. The church, in practice, often accommodated fairy belief, recognizing it as an integral part of Celtic cultural identity. This syncretism reached its fullest expression in the Creed Banshee, the fairy faith, which existed as a parallel tradition alongside Christianity. People attended Mass, received sacraments, and observed Christian holy days, while simultaneously leaving offerings for fairies, avoiding fairy mounds, and observing the old protections. They saw no contradiction, for fairies and Christianity occupied different spheres of concern. Christianity addressed salvation and the relationship with God, while fairy belief dealt with the practical realities of daily life in a world that contained more than what was immediately visible. The fairies of Celtic mythology left an indelible mark on the cultures that believed in them, an influence that persists even in the modern age. Though few today actively believe in fairy folk in the traditional sense, the legacy of these beliefs continues to shape Celtic identity, landscape, and culture in profound ways. In Ireland, fairy forts remain largely undisturbed despite the potential agricultural value of the land they occupy. These ring forts, ancient earthwork enclosures dating back centuries, are still widely known as fairy forts or raths, believed to be fairy dwellings. Farmers continue to plow around them rather than through them, not always from active belief, but from respect for tradition and an unwillingness to risk bad luck. Several modern construction projects have been altered or canceled due to their proximity to fairy sites, most famously the Clare to Galway motorway, which was rerouted to avoid destroying a fairy tree that stood in the planned path. The contractor who had initially cut down part of the tree allegedly experienced such misfortune that work stopped until the route was changed. Similarly, lone hawthorn trees standing in fields are left untouched. These solitary thorns, often called fairy trees, are believed to be meeting places or portals for the fairy folk. Cutting one down is still considered deeply unlucky, and many Irish people can recount stories of misfortunes that befell those who damaged fairy trees. This protection has preserved many ancient specimens that might otherwise have been removed. creating points of natural heritage within agricultural landscapes.
The influence of fairy belief extends beyond preserved sites.
Celtic languages retain vocabulary and idioms related to fairies. Irish Gaelic phrases warn of fairy intervention in daily misfortunes, and euphemisms for fairies remain in common use, even among those who claim no belief. The very landscape is understood through fairy associations, with countless places named for fairy connections, from Slievenman, the mountain of the women of the fairy mound, to innumerable wells, hills, and valleys that bear fairy-related names. Celtic arts draw continuously on fairy traditions. Literature, from the poetry of William Butler Yeats to the novels of contemporary Irish authors, references and reimagines fairy lore. Music, both traditional and modern, echoes with fairy themes. Visual arts depict fairy scenes, and theater regularly adapts fairy tales and encounters. This artistic engagement keeps the traditions alive, reinterpreting them for each new generation.
Tourism in Celtic regions often centers on fairy heritage.
Visitors come to see fairy glens and fairy pools, to hear traditional storytellers recount old legends, to visit sites associated with famous fairy tales. This commercial aspect might seem to trivialize the beliefs, yet it also ensures their transmission, keeping alive stories that might otherwise fade from memory.
Perhaps most significantly, Celtic fairy traditions have influenced global culture.
The word fairy itself, derived from the Old French fée,
gained much of its current meaning and associations through Celtic traditions. When English-speaking peoples think of fairies, they think largely of Celtic fairies, even if filtered through Victorian and modern reinterpretations. The concept of fairies as powerful, potentially dangerous supernatural beings, distinct from both angels and demons, as creatures of nature with their own societies and rules. These ideas come primarily from Celtic sources. The Changelings, the fairy rings, the danger of fairy food,
the time distortion in fairy lands, the use of iron for protection, countless elements now considered standard fairy lore originated in or were significantly developed by Celtic traditions. Fantasy literature and media draw heavily on these concepts, often without recognizing their specific cultural origins. Celtic fairy lore has become part of the global fantasy imagination.
Yet the core of Celtic fairy tradition
remains rooted in its original cultural context. The fairies emerged from the landscape and mythology of Celtic peoples, embodying their understanding of nature, divinity, and the supernatural. They represented forces beyond human control, yet intimately connected to human life. They demanded respect, caution, and acknowledgement that the world contained mysteries and powers that could not be fully understood or mastered. The fairy traditions also served psychological and social functions. They provided explanations for misfortune, creating external causes for tragedies that might otherwise seem meaninglessly cruel. They enforced social norms and taught important lessons. They connected communities to their past and their landscape. They acknowledged the liminal, the in-between spaces and times where normal rules broke down and anything might happen. They gave expression to fears and hopes, to the sense that reality contained more than the merely physical.
Today, as modern life seems increasingly divorced from nature and tradition,
the fairies of Celtic mythology offer something valuable. They remind us that our ancestors saw the world as alive with meaning, that they understood themselves as part of a larger whole that included the supernatural. They demonstrate the power of story and tradition to shape culture across centuries. And they preserve a worldview that, whatever its literal truth, recognize profound truths about the relationship between humanity and the world we inhabit.
The Celtic fairies
endure because they speak to something fundamental in human experience.
The sense that there is more to reality than what we can immediately perceive. that the natural world contains intelligences and forces beyond our comprehension, that some places and times feel charged with otherworldly presence. These feelings are universal, even if their interpretation varies across cultures. Celtic fairy traditions gave sophisticated and culturally specific expression to these universal intuitions, creating a rich mythology that continues to fascinate and inspire. If you've enjoyed this journey into the realm of Celtic fairies, discovering the truth behind these powerful beings who are so far removed from modern fairy tale interpretations, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into mythology and folklore from around the world. Share your thoughts in the comments and also tell us what kind of next video would you like. Until next time, tread carefully when you walk past ancient mounds and solitary hawthorns. The good neighbors may be watching.